Honorable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs, distinguished dignitaries, a very good evening and warm welcome to third edition of Yadu Nath Khanal lecture series. Thank you all for gracing us with your valuable presence. To begin the proceedings, I have the honor to invite Foreign Secretary Madam Seva Lamsal to deliver her welcome remarks.
Honorable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs, Mr. Naran Kaji Shrestha. Honorable Justices of the Supreme Court of Nepal. Honorable former Foreign Ministers. Honorable Members of the Parliament. Esteemed National Security Advisor. Esteemed Chief Secretary and Secretaries. Keynote speaker of today's event, Professor C. Raja Mohan. Distinguished guests, friends from the media, colleagues from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, ladies and gentlemen, namaste and a very good evening to you all. It is my distinct honor and profound privilege to welcome you all to the third edition of Professor Yadu Nath Khanal Lecture Series, a milestone program of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs commenced in 2022. On this momentous occasion, on behalf of the Ministry and on my own, I would like to extend my sincere gratitude to you all for accepting our invitation and joining us this evening. I'm pleased to share with you all that the Ministry launched Professor Yadu Nath Khanal Lecture Series 2 years back. It's a flagship annual program of the Ministry in recognition as well as in the honor of the outstanding contribution of late Professor Yadu Nath Khanal in shaping Nepal's foreign policy and crafting diplomacy during its formative years. We have envisioned this platform to foster deliberations of different dimensions on Nepal's foreign policy matters, as well as the contemporary issues in international relations and diplomacy. The overarching objective of this program is to provide a distinguished forum for discussions and deliberations and for propagating and exchanging innovative ideas and thoughts on emerging issues of foreign policy and diplomacy. Its core objective is to offer a contemporary outlook on the subject matter that would help practitioners of this field in conducting diplomacy amidst the ever-evolving regional and global dynamism. The lecture series is expected to bring in knowledge, expertise, experience, and insights from renowned diplomats, policymakers, professors, and researchers on diverse range of themes of Nepal's foreign policy conduct. In today's lecture, we expect to stimulate informed deliberations on the issues of national, regional, and global importance. The lecture is also expected to inspire opinion shapers, policymakers, and practitioners to nurture better insight into the essence of Nepal-India relations. Distinguished guests, Professor Yadu Nath Khanal was born in Midwest of Nepal in Tanahu district, currently in Gandaki province, in August 1913. He studied Sanskrit, Science, and English literature from Nepal, India, and the United Kingdom. Professor Khanal harbored diverse career as a professor, scholar, senior government official in various capacities, and a refined diplomat. He served as Secretary to Prime Minister, as a member of Planning Council, Chair of Tribhuvan University Service Commission, and Public Service Commission at various times. His career in diplomacy began in 1955 is a member of Nepali delegation to the Afro-Asian Conference held in Bandung, Indonesia. Thereafter, he continued to achieve higher milestones in Nepal's diplomacy. He was appointed Foreign Secretary twice in 1961 and 1967. Professor Khanal served as ambassador of Nepal to India, to the United States, and to China. He was actively contributing to Nepal's diplomacy as late as 1992 when he participated in the 10th NAM summit in Jakarta, Indonesia, as a minister-ranked delegate. Professor Khanal passed away in 2004. He also published books on various dimensions of Nepal's foreign policy. Professor Khanal, through his diplomatic acumen and writings, set guidelines on how Nepal could pursue its vital national interest against the constraint of the time. His vast experience, incisive observation, wisdom, and pragmatism conveyed through his writings continue to inspire and guide succeeding generations of Nepali intellectuals, policymakers, and foreign policy practitioners. His core message that a country like Nepal needs to maintain clarity, consistency, credibility, and coherence while orchestrating diplomacy and foreign policy stands like a mantra of all time. Distinguished guests, having said this, let me introduce the man of the day, our distinguished guest, Professor C. Raja Mohan, who will deliver his lecture on Nepal-India relations, prospects, and pathways today. He treasures a distinguished career as a renowned professor, an accomplished academician, and a proficient foreign policy analyst in the domain of contemporary international relations vis-à-vis India's external engagement with other countries. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to our distinguished guest for accepting our request to share his thoughts on this important topic despite his very busy schedule. I am confident that the lecture will give us useful insights and a comprehensive analysis on multidimensional aspects and prospects of Nepal-India relations. Professor C. Raja Mohan is a visiting research professor at the Institute of South Asian Studies, where he earlier served as the director. He was professor of South Asian Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. Professor Mohan is one of India's leading commentators and analysts on India's foreign policy. He has been associated with a number of think tanks in New Delhi as well. He writes a regular column for the Indian Express and was earlier the strategic affairs editor for the Hindu newspaper, Chennai. He is on the editorial boards of several Indian and international journals on world politics. Professor Mohan has a master's degree in nuclear physics and a PhD in international relations. Among his recent books are Samudra Manthan, Sino-Indian Rivalry in the Indo-Pacific 2013, and Modi's World, Expanding India's Sphere of Influence 2015. With this, now I welcome to you Professor Raja Mohan to the podium, and thank you all for your kind attention.
Thank you, Foreign Secretary Lamsal, for that very generous introduction. Honorable Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, and distinguished members of this very special audience here. It's really a pleasure and a privilege for me to be here with all of you this evening to deliver this lecture in memoriam of a scholar diplomat who's had such a distinguished career in shaping Nepal's engagement with the world. I also want to I also want to say it's such a pleasure to be here among so many mentors and friends. I was happy to see Professor Lokraj Baral. I wished him well, and I also saw Ambassador Beg Bahadur Thapa, who I spent a lot of time at his residence in Delhi for years when he was the ambassador. I'm not going to blame him for my misperceptions, but it's really a pleasure to see him here, and so many other friends from JNU, from various other fields that I've known over the last 30 years here in Nepal. So when I got the invitation, I was quick to accept it. But then, as Americans say, I was quickly struck with buyer's remorse. That is it a smart move to come to Kathmandu and talk about India-Nepal relations, especially when we have so many controversies that are unfolding today in the relationship. So I'm not wearing a flak jacket, but I'm here to deal with this very, very important relationship. It was also, whatever the hesitation that I had, it's really, I wouldn't have passed up an opportunity to come to this wonderful country and be with all of you this evening. But the fact is that given the complex history of our relationship, the multiple sensitivities in the discourse on this relationship, and the range of issues in contention today, that any task of addressing India-Nepal relations and to speculate, reflect on its prospects and pathways is quite challenging. But as a scholar of Indian foreign policy, of India's grand strategy, and as a long-time observer of India's international relations and South Asian politics, I hope I can offer some dispassionate analysis of the context and where India and Nepal might be headed. My focus in this lecture today is not on the minutiae of the immediate issues of the bilateral relationship. I would disappoint those who are looking for me to respond to some of the headlines or the contentions that are today in play between the two countries. What I would do is really, I'm not a representative of the government of India. I never worked in the government of India. So I'm not speaking for anyone else in India. I'm only speaking for myself as someone who's been in Delhi on the ring side of India's engagement with its neighbors and the world. So this is purely my view, my personal view, my experience, what I draw from that, rather than, but if you want to listen to the MEA's view, you don't need me. I mean, that your foreign policy community anyway deals with them on a regular basis. What I'll do today is really to begin with a brief review of the global order, follow it up, because there's a moment of great turbulence in the world, follow it up with an assessment of the changing regional structure today in front of us, and then move on to discuss the burden of history in our relationship, the geography that binds us, and the challenges of managing what I call the politics of proximity, that being so close to each other, so interconnected, brings its own challenges. And then I'll conclude with a reflection on the importance of putting pragmatism above ideology in restructuring Nepal-India relationship. So let me start with the changing global order. I would like to present the possibilities for a deeper relationship between Nepal and India in the broader context of changing global order, political, economic, and strategic. Why do we want to look at the global situation in a session to discuss bilateral relations between Nepal and India? But I believe no bilateral relationship, however intense and close it might be, can be pursued in isolation from the rest of the world, especially now at a time of extraordinary changes that are unfolding in the world. To be sure, local specificities of history and geography that are entrenched and enduring in any relationship. But they acquire an ever-changing expression and character under the influence of global trends. While they're permanent features, there are also changes in the way they play themselves out in the global context. Even a preliminary reflection of the situation suggests how central was the changing relationship between United States, Soviet Union, and China in shaping the relationship between Nepal and India at a time when Professor Khanal was in charge of Nepal's diplomacy in the 1960s. Today, we are, I believe, arguably in a similar moment of major shifts in great power relations. Similarly, the regional dynamic in Asia continues to provide a very critical context for the engagement between Kathmandu and Delhi. Last few years have seen a profound change in the international system. I would say three features stand out in the world today. The first is the return of the great power rivalry, what seemed to be something of the past that ended during 1989-91 with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact. But today, a Cold War of sorts is back, and the great powers are at each other's throat. For more than 4 decades, the rivalry between US and the Soviet Union enveloped all dimensions of human activity in the second half of the 20th century. The demise of the Soviet Union marked a profound shift in the global balance of power in favor of the United States, and that had no competitor in the so-called unipolar movement. The collapse of the Soviet Union marked the disintegration of a great power, and that had great influence, not only in Europe, but across the world. The Soviet collapse also discredited the political and economic ideas of Marxism and communism that had such powerful appeal from the middle of the 19th century. Of course, Marxism and communism endure in some parts of the world. I'm not referring to Nepal, but I'm referring to the humanities departments of American universities, which are today one of the biggest strongholds of Marxist ideas, and you see that some of it in the American campuses today. The triumph of liberal democracy and capitalism was viewed as the end of history and the political contestation over the organization of modern societies. But it did not take long for the unipolar movement to dissipate. The rapid rise of China in the 21st century and its assertion has presented the United States a powerful challenge. Although Russia is much weaker than the United States, it has demonstrated sufficient capability to destabilize the security order in Europe and challenge the Western powers in multiple global theaters, including in Africa. Moscow, however, continues to be an attractive partner for India and others in Asia. To make matters more complicated, China and Russia announced a partnership without limits in 2022 that are testing the Western ability to manage the global order. The contest between the West on the one hand and the Sino-Russian Entente on the other are compelling much of the world to rethink their strategic relations. Nepal and India have operated in a relatively stable international system since the turn of the 1990s. We had the luxury of taking the world for granted. Today, Kathmandu and Delhi have no option but to recalibrate their worldview, adjust their foreign policies to deal with a rapidly changing structure of great power relations. Adding to this challenge is a second factor, the growing strain on the framework of globalization that decision makers in Kathmandu and Delhi believed was irreversible. Irrespective of the traditional ideologies, all political groups and parties that have governed these two countries since the dawn of the 1990s had adapted one way or another to the imperatives of economic globalization. But now, Delhi and Kathmandu must come to terms with a new phase in the global economy in which the number one and the number two economies, the US and China, are retreating from globalization and are locked in a massive trade and technological war. And this reality is not just a political contest, but now it is a contest for the global economy and the shaping of the evolution of technology. This in turn puts enormous pressure on the World Trade Organization that was set up in 1995 with great expectations to move the international system towards an agreed set of rules on governing trans-border commerce. China's entry into the WTO in 2001 was championed by the US and had set the stage for a rapid economic integration of the world. But today, US and China are a profound confrontation that encompasses almost all dimensions of human activity. Countries like India and Nepal, we would have preferred a single set of global economic rules, because one of the great advantages of WTO for newly globalizing economies like India, or for small economies, for small states, was there were an agreed set of rules we could work under. But today, that luxury is no longer there, and Delhi and Kathmandu will now have to deal with an increasingly fragmented global economy that will demand making hard political choices on preferred commercial relationships. That is, we could say, most countries say, we don't want to make choices, but the way the situation is unfolding, making choices might be inevitable, not just on political issues, but on economic issues and on technological issues. That brings me to the third aspect of change. The AI, artificial intelligence, and the digital revolution are also promising to make a number of traditional professions, including white-collar ones, unsustainable as it automates a large number of functions, including white-collar work. This, in turn, forces countries, large and small, to make major decisions in restructuring their economies and protecting them from the challenges of disinformation and fake news. So the return of great power rivalry, the resurgence of geoeconomics, and the revolution in technology does not necessarily mean we face a bleak international environment. It is certainly different from the one that we've known in the 1990s. But the new situation also offers interesting possibilities for those nations that are conscious of the changing global dynamic, are flexible enough to adapt to the new possibilities arising from the changing order. Therefore, there is agency, notwithstanding the nature of the confrontation and the nature of the changing economic order. There is agency for a large number of countries, and the challenge is, how do we exercise that political agency in this complex world? So that brings me to the second element of my lecture today, which is the new regional order. Most regions of the world and their institutional structures have been deeply affected by the global dynamic that we've just reviewed. South Asia is no exception. Several broad changes in the subcontinent are easily identified. First is the impact of the great power rivalry on the region. For centuries now, it is the dynamic of conflict and cooperation among the European powers that shaped the political and economic evolution of the rest of the world. The 20th century saw the rise of the United States and the Soviet Union as superpowers that overshadowed the European powers of the 19th century. Europe, however, remained the principal theater of global conflict in the second half of the 20th century. To be sure, there was vigorous rivalry in other parts of the world, including the subcontinent, but we were not the decisive theaters. And that's where the big change comes in today. Today, notwithstanding the war in the heart of Europe, it is Asia that is the principal theater of contestation. It's also a fact that Asia has now a large number of risen and rising great powers who are going to shape the destiny of the rest of the world. So from being mere passive consumers of the global order, today Asia is in a position with all its problems and contradictions that's going to set the stage for the international system as a whole. This is not surprising, given the fact that the rise of China as a great power has profoundly altered the hierarchy of the global power and put Beijing as the dominant power in Asia and the global competitor for the US and the West. Although Russia has challenged the territorial order in Europe, established after 1991, the US national security strategy of 2022 sees China as the main challenger of the US-led order. Russia, they see as a short-term problem, but China is the real peer competitor with the capacity to fundamentally challenge the American position in the global order and with the capacity to rearrange the global system. For more than 4 decades, since the early 70s, the relationship between US and China had steadily expanded. Many of us familiar with the phrase chimerica in those days. And their common interest to counter Moscow endured until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. So we thought in 1989, after the Tiananmen revolt, US and China will drift apart. But what happened was Deng Xiaoping's second wave of reforms in the 1990s led to an explosive expansion of commercial and technological cooperation between China and the United States. Some of you might recall Deng's famous southern tour when he went to the southern regions and said, we're going to start again, that we're going to do reform, notwithstanding what happened in '89, that more reform, more economic liberalization was what opened up Chinese market for the American capital, which came in and transformed the relationship in extraordinary ways. But this era of American capital and the Chinese market working together, that era has come to an end. Now, Washington now is trying to de-risk or decouple its economic ties with China and is encouraging its allies in Europe and Asia to do the same. To counter an increasingly powerful and assertive China, the US is boosting its military presence in the Western Pacific, revitalizing its traditional alliances with Australia, Japan, and the Philippines. It is also building new strategic partnerships with countries like India, which is supposed to be non-aligned, but today we are close to the United States. Vietnam, which is a communist country, but is also engaging the United States. Indonesia, one of the founders of the non-aligned movement, is also engaging the US in military sphere. So what you have is actually the creation of a new coalition, including the allies, and a whole range of strategic partners who are coming together with the US to deal with the Chinese power and its impact on regional balance. So where do we stand here then? With Asia emerging as the main arena of great power rivalry, the subcontinent is and will be drawn much more directly into this conflict between US and China. In the case of Soviet Union and the United States, we could duck. We could say, look, this is far away because we didn't have borders with Russia. But today with China, we have borders. So China is next door. So what happens between China and the US is going to draw all of us into this new contestation between US and China. And South Asia is already in the front lines of this great contestation between US and China. And it's not just in the land, but also in the water, because much of the maritime competition between US and China also takes place in the waters of South Asia. A second major trend in Asia today is the fact that the unfolding rivalry between United States and China has been accompanied by a renewed conflict between India and China. This is now, there's no sign of it ending anytime soon. And if you heard our foreign minister repeatedly say that there are serious issues in this relationship and that resolving those tensions don't seem to be on the cards, at least for now. So America's deepening conflict with China has coincided with Delhi's deteriorating relations with Beijing. A series of military crises in 2013, 2014, 2017, and 2020 have led to the dismantling of the regime of peace and tranquility in the Himalayas that was established after Rajiv Gandhi's historic visit to China in 1988. I would say between 1988 to 2008, there was a period of relative stability in India-China relations, and there was also an expanding structure of cooperation between the two countries. Even today, China is one of India's major trading partners. But that period of stability in India-China relations is now behind us, thanks to the breakdown of the border management mechanisms and the growing political distrust between Delhi and Beijing. The armed forces of India and China are locked in a military standoff in eastern Ladakh for 4 years. Even more important, there is a semi-permanent military confrontation. It's not just in eastern Ladakh, all across this massive Himalayan frontier, a disputed frontier. The two armies are facing each other, modernizing their infrastructure, and creating capabilities for surge and surprise at the point of choosing. So the intensifying contradictions with China have seen India recalibrate its relations recalibrate its great power relations and finesse its traditional strategy of non-alignment. India today is closer than ever before to the United States. Yet Delhi also has a substantive and growing trade ties with Beijing. India has also sought to retain a strong relationship with Russia and has stepped up the engagement with Europe and Japan. As India deals with the principal contradiction between US and China, its South Asian neighbors must deal with the twin rivalries. So simultaneously, you have to deal with the US-China rivalry as well as India-China rivalry, and both are going to be have significant effects on the South Asian region as a whole. Any assessment of these rivalries will suggest that they are here to stay, and coping with them will be a major preoccupation for all the countries of South Asia. Pakistan, for example, which has had good relations with the US and China, they were the only country which had great relationship with both, are today struggling to navigate between the conflict between two of the best friends and allies over the decades. Landlocked Nepal has had to engage with the maritime, Indo-Pacific. You would think, what has landlocked Nepal has to do with Indo-Pacific? But there it is. It's a major debate that it is linked to the conflict between US and China. The island states of South Asia, Sri Lanka and Maldives, are spending considerable part of the diplomatic and political energies in coping with the shifting triangular dynamic between Delhi, Beijing, and Washington. That's already become part of the landscape in which most of the South Asian neighbors have to operate. Finally, the return of great power rivalry presents a paradox for South Asia. Contestation between US and China has made it more difficult for many regional organizations in Asia. The ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, is struggling to fulfill its mandate for regional security and stability. New institutions are coming up in Asia. The Quad, which India, Japan, Australia, and the US. There is AUKUS, which is Australia, UK, and the United States, doing nuclear submarines and advanced technologies, most likely to include soon Japan, South Korea, and probably New Zealand. That's what the negotiations have started. The so-called Chip-4 alliance, that is alliance between US, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan, the 4 countries that produce the maximum semiconductors today. They formed an alliance called the Chip-4 alliance. And of course, the latest in this list of new institutions, there are 2. One is the Northeast Asia Trilateral, that is between Korea, Japan, and the United States. Korea and Japan, as you know, are like India and Pakistan, but they're today working closely with the US. And then there's something called the Squad, that is Philippines, US, Japan, and Australia, which is focused on South China Sea and the challenges presented by Chinese role in South China Sea. So there you are. The old regional institutions are struggling. At the intensifying great power rivalry and the breakdown of the global economic order built after 1991, demand more regional cooperation and not less. So therefore, how do we do this when old regional institutions are breaking down? How do we do more regional cooperation? And this is going to be a big challenge. The institutional format is perhaps less important today than the practical expansion of regional cooperation through whichever means possible. That is bilateral, sub-regional, and trans-regional. So this is the old institutions are struggling, therefore, we have to work with whatever institutions and mechanisms we can find. So I would say, rather than bemoan the failure of SAARC and lament the lack of regional cooperation in South Asia, we could look at the slow but certain expansion of regional connectivity and trade volumes. That is, what I'm going to say is something controversial. Institutions are not necessarily a precondition for expanding trade. The trade and connectivity can be expanded through other means. Bangladesh and Nepal today are major trading partners for India. It would seem entirely possible to build practically on these emerging possibilities for cooperation rather than hanging on to say, look, we'll only do it in a particular format, but we can talk about this a little more later. That brings me to the bilateral challenges between India and Nepal. The review of changing global and regional orders has outlined the present challenges and future possibilities for Nepal-India relationship. As I mentioned earlier, I do not want to get into the weeds of the relationship. the range of issues at hand are diverse, and some of them have proved to be intractable. What I hope to do in the rest of the lecture is to examine some of the structural challenges that bedevil the relationship in the domains of history, geography, economics, and ideology. So let me begin with the burden of history. History is always a good teacher in understanding the state of any phenomenon at the moment, but history can also be a burden that shackles our thinking and prevents us from responding to contemporary challenges. Learning the right lessons from history must be balanced with the capacity to unlearn some of the history that we all have grown up with. So learning as well as unlearning become important in dealing with the burden of the past. History has long been a major constraint on Nepal-India relations, especially for Delhi. A lot of it, that history, has to do with the legacy of the British Raj that was premised on an exclusive relationship between Calcutta and Kathmandu, or Delhi and Kathmandu later. This framework of a special relationship between the Raj and Nepal was reaffirmed in the 1950 Treaty of Eternal Friendship between India and Nepal. That approach has come under a shadow in the post-British era. A growing sense of national identity and reduced fears of a threat of a Maoist China made the treaty less acceptable to Nepal's leaders. India, however, has clung on to the notion of an exclusive sphere of influence in South Asia, even as the ground reality made it impossible to sustain. The partition of the Indian subcontinent, India's quarrels with the West on a range of regional issues, the emergence of a coherent China after a prolonged fratricidal civil war in the middle of the 20th century fundamentally altered the structure of regional politics from one we saw under the British period. So the question of how do we deal with the Raj legacy became a principal question, and I think we're still struggling to come to terms with that. The legacy involved, the British legacy, Raj legacy involved 3 security treaties signed during 1949-50 with Bhutan, Sikkim, and Nepal at a time when the PLA entered Tibet. The ambiguity about India's relationship with Sikkim was resolved in 1975 with Sikkim's integration. India revised a treaty with Bhutan in 2006 to make it more in sync with the 21st century realities. But the treaty with Nepal is in a limbo, depending on how you want to describe it. But I think here we are, a treaty that is contested, argued about, but at the same time, both sides have problems in completely dismantling it. Therefore, here we are with an instrument whose security provisions have long become inoperative, but it remains a symbol of unequal relationship between Kathmandu and Delhi. On the face of it, there is a strong case for a new treaty between the two nations that reflects the contemporary shared interests of the two countries. Since the two governments are not negotiating a new version, I had a suggestion that maybe some of the think tanks can get together as a thought experiment. How would a new treaty look like from first principles? So that will force us, I think, this thought experiment might say, well, the governments have a lot of issues because you can't simply disown something that existed for so long. But a thought experiment of drafting a treaty by experts from the two sides can at least lay bare what binds us, what are our common interests, and how do we manage it, rather than just keep arguing about the past and its durability. Some would say, really, a treaty is by no means a precondition for good relations. The question is not about drafting a new text, but learning to build a live and productive relationship that is in the interest of the two people. That is, what we need is a functioning relationship devised from common sense and first principles, rather than waving a piece of paper that here it is. That's the only way we can construct a sustainable relationship. I think in Delhi, at least, this is my view, there is a growing recognition among the realists that India's regional influence will come from material capabilities and effective policies rather than holding on to a piece of paper. As a realist myself, I would say Treaties are there, but it is what you do, going back to Marx, material conditions are actually are far more consequential than inherited piece of paper on which a lot of times we argue. So therefore, I would say, at least for realists in Delhi at least, that we got to rethink the sources of India's primacy, and that requires a reset, and we see some of that already unfolding. Delhi is also acutely conscious that the subcontinent, which is globalized and widely connected, can no longer be India's exclusive sphere of influence. That is, just as now Chinese friends say, look, Indian Ocean is not India's ocean. Indians will say South China Sea is not China's sea. So South Asia is not the property of India. Just as Asia, where sometimes the Chinese friends say Asia for Asians. That doesn't mean China has a monopoly over Asia. There is Japan, there is India, So I think what we have is really that don't get stuck in slogans, but I think look at the reality on the ground. That is, with the rise of a great power next door to South Asia, and those of you, I don't know how many flights go from Kathmandu to the Gulf every day. The Gulf today is the new reality in South Asia. Those of you who are following Pakistan will know how much Pakistan is putting its energies into wooing Saudi and the Emiratis investment. Today, the three countries, Qatar, Saudi, and the UAE, have become together, hold so much capital in their sovereign wealth funds. India alone has 8 million expatriate labor in the Gulf, and if you put together all the South Asians, it'll be close to 12, 13 million. It's not a small number. So the connection between Gulf capital and South Asia, Gulf money and our development, you're going to see increasingly the interpenetration of the Gulf. So therefore, there's no way you can say simply South Asia, draw a circle around it and say this is an exclusive sphere of influence for any. And I think Delhi beginnings to see that reality today. It's also reality that China's growing role in the subcontinent, how much we like it or not like it, is a natural consequence of its rise as a great power. If China can be influential in Latin America, in Central America, in the Pacific Islands, it should not be a shock that they're a major player in South Asia today. And I think that's a reality. So realists have to deal with realities, and I think that too is with us. Although some of the current global literature talks about the return of spheres of influence, maintaining such exclusive zones has become hard for any major power. That is, in the integrating world, cross-cutting connections, that there's going to be no corner which somebody can say, I own this piece of land. Moscow, for example, is trying to reconstruct the lost sphere of influence in Central Europe, but its war against Kiev has turned Ukraine into a real nation that is unlikely to ever go back into the fold of Moscow. Other states in Central Europe are drawing closer to the West in trying to secure themselves against Russian expansionism. Protectorates is a notion from the era of empires, and that has little relevance in the 21st century. That brings me to the second set of issues, which is about borders. Borders, what the nature of borders, they open or closed. Let me go into this part with some detail. Some view geography as a tyranny because you can't get out of the geographic condition that you are in. But others view geography is also destiny. Instead of perceiving geography as an unalterable constraint, sensible statecraft will try and work with it to maximize the opportunities for progress. Bad policies can make even a favorable geography into a problem. Sensible policies, in contrast, can help overcome limitations of geography. Consider, for example, India. Although India had a massive coastline, it didn't pay any attention to sea until the 1990s. That we turned to the sea only when we opened up our economy. So having a long coastline didn't make any difference to Indian policies because as economically we were closed. Having chosen inward-oriented state socialism as its developmental policy after independence, Delhi turned India voluntarily into a landlocked nation. focusing on import substitution, rejecting an export-led growth, which the rest of Asia was doing. That is, you don't have to be geographically landlocked, but you can voluntarily make yourself landlocked by your policies. Kathmandu, in contrast, was among the first in the subcontinent to experiment with an open economy. In fact, the foreign tourists, we used to sit in Delhi in Sapru House, watch all the international visitors coming to the Nepalese embassy to get visas to go to Nepal, because they could get it only in Delhi. The experiment, of course, did not last long, but I think it's important to remember that it is not a preordained constraint that you can only have a closed economy, and I think that there are other ways in which we can make progress. In Nepal today, there's much angst about being landlocked and its location between two large Asian giants. This condition, I believe, is not unique to Nepal. The history of international relations is replete with examples of nations that have felt squeezed by their neighbors. What is the yam between the rocks, and we can go into more detail on that. South Korea, for example, sees itself as a shrimp among the whales being Japan, US, China. Singapore, a city-state with no resources of its own, has turned its location at the maritime junction between the Pacific and the Indian Ocean into an enormous business opportunity. Mongolia, sandwiched between Russia and China, has built a vast network of international relations by reaching out what it calls third neighbors. It has only two neighbors, but the strategy of third neighbors meant it is actively cultivated a network of relationships beyond the two neighbors, so that you create a balance to the structure of your nation's international relations. As we look ahead, Nepal and India must also pay attention to the idea of geoeconomics. Across the world, the idea of uncritical globalization is yielding focus to economic security, nearshoring, friendshoring, and the development of trusted geographies. That is, the old framework of globalization is yielding place to new networks of economic cooperation, and Delhi is striving to be part of it, and I'm sure Nepal will too. As the global economic system, erected after the Cold War, goes through a major change, trading with the neighbors has become more important than ever before. In Delhi, at least, there is a growing recognition that we need to do more on trade and connectivity with our neighbors. This underlines the extraordinary importance of open border for our future relationship. Not all legacies might be worth preserving, but I would say an open border, a well-managed border, an economic border is worth preserving between India and Nepal. Many countries are struggling to get to the benefit that we have, while it would be unwise, I think, to discard what we already have in the form of an open border. Delhi and Kathmandu must not only value the legacy of an open border, but also build on it. India, I believe, has a special responsibility. Independent India's economic strategy had for decades focused on import substitution and underemphasized the importance of trade for national development and prosperity. Fortunately, that's beginning to change. India's agenda on transforming the open border with Nepal into a zone of commerce and people-to-people interaction remains unfinished. Recent years have seen some improvement, but there's a lot that can be done on the front of trade promotion, trade facilitation, and the modernization of the border infrastructure on the Indian side. In both countries, there have often been temptations to weaponize the border, either consciously or unconsciously, with terrible consequences. Helping adversaries of the other misuse the open border raises calls for closing the border by one side, and closing the border to extract political concessions produces a backlash among the other countries. So I think our recent experience gives us a lot of valuable lessons, and I'm sure both sides are reflecting on it. At the same time, it's also important to note the asymmetric nature of the border. This is my view, which is, you can say Nepal has two neighbors, which is China and India. But if you see purely from an economic lens of these two borders, they're not symmetric. If Nepal's north is sparsely populated, its southern frontier is one of the most densely populated in the world. The question then is not about choosing between the two, or balancing between the two, or bridging the two, but it's about building on the available opportunities between Delhi and Kathmandu and transforming the southern slopes and foothills of Himalayas into a genuine zone of connectivity that should be at the top of the national priorities. That is, you start from the first principles of economics, not from principles of a foreign policy or ideology that would distort that. Where there is an opportunity, you take that opportunity rather than putting the cart before the horse. So that brings me to the third section, which is the geopolitics of proximity. Managing relations with the neighbors is always the essence of foreign policy. After all, borders are where one nation's sovereignty ends, another begins. Even with the best of intentions, the challenge of managing territorial disputes, border security, river water sharing, minorities, and subnational interaction and environmental protection is a very demanding one. Neighborhood ties demand continuous tending that involves resolution of issues, preventing the emergence of new disputes. This involves building trust through sustained interaction at all levels, from the highest political level at the federal level to the local authorities. No one in Delhi or Kathmandu can claim that the two nations have excelled at this task, so there's a lot to be done on this front. I want to underline two interrelated issues that have continuously complicated Nepal-India relationship. One is about the small state imperative of seeking autonomy from a large and overwhelming neighbor. The other is the responsibility of the largest state for reassuring the smaller neighbor. Both are important. I mean, it's not that one is more important than the other. And so therefore, respecting the sensitivities of smaller neighbors and their concerns for sovereignty and intervention must figure more prominently in India's own discourse. Living in the shadow of a large neighbor inevitably produces the demands for strategic autonomy. But when the bigger state is seen as threatening, the logical next step is to try and balance the larger power with the help of a third. This is not common. This is not a condition that is unique to India's neighbors, but quite common across all regions. Through much of Latin America, the resentment against US domination has been endemic. In Europe, the fear of Germany and Russia through the last 2 centuries has seen neighbors seek autonomy or balance. In Asia, the fear of an expansionist China drives many into the arms of the US. So this is a natural part of international relations. But the art of seeking autonomy and balance is a complicated one. India, whose territorial disputes with China have been reignited, is careful in choosing how far to go with the United States. While Delhi seeks to enhance its security against Beijing in partnership with the US, India is also careful to stay within the limits and to avoid provoking China. That is, between balancing and provoking, there is a thin line. That's one reason India is not willing to make the Quad a military alliance or seek greater US support in managing its border security in the Himalayas. Ukraine caught between EU and NATO on the one hand, and Russia on the other, is paying a high price today for mismanaging the delicate balance between two large and competing powers. We could argue endlessly whether Russia provoked Ukraine or Ukraine provoked Russia, but the fact is the damage to both sides has been extensive. Probing the limits of what is permissible in a complex situation if it's not done with care, can be a recipe for disaster. It'll be interesting to see how the current conflict between China and the Philippines works out. Its president, Ferdinand Marcos, is making his situation worse. Is he making it worse by turning to the US? Or is the US helping him build deterrence against China? The situation in the Philippines tells us there is no single national perspective to the problem of managing disputes with a larger neighbor. Marcos's predecessor, Duterte, chose to embrace Beijing rather than fight China over the territorial dispute in South China Sea. But today, Marcos's policy is completely the opposite. So in the same country, you can have divergent approaches to dealing with this problem. And this is where I think it's very important to have a consensus within, that not having a consensus creates all kinds of problems. Internal political divergence on how to address external challenges could be quite consequential. We've seen this go to the extreme in the case of Maldives, where domestic political leadership has oscillated wildly between India first to India out. To be sure, Maldives has the sovereign right to make its choices, but violent swings in foreign policy orientation produce costs of their own. They also increase the incentive for external powers to align with friendly forces within the internal affairs of the states. So building a domestic consensus on how to deal with the world is critical for stability and progress of smaller states. That brings me to the importance of reassurance. Now we talk about the big powers. Small countries do pay a big price for mismanaging the relationship with a large neighbor, especially when they seek to get another power to balance it. In the end, the margin of error for the bigger power is large and can afford to take risks. We've seen in the case of Russia took a risk. And Ukraine is having serious problems with the choices that it has made. Even more important, the big powers make deals between themselves. Today already the speculation, I don't know, those of you saw reports from London that Mr. David Cameron went to Trump and told him, we're coming to a point we have to do a deal with Russia, therefore improve your bargaining power. So in the end, if Russia and the US do a deal, Europe will be left holding the sack. When it chose to confront Russia, Ukraine was probably confident of winning enduring Western support. 2.5 years into the war, there are deep divisions within the West, and within each of them on how far to go in supporting Ukraine. This does not mean the big powers do not have cause. A large state that fails at reassuring its neighbors could push them into a countervailing coalition. So prudence is a virtue not only for the smaller state, but also for the bigger one. In occupying eastern Ukraine, Russia has helped expand the NATO alliance. But it's also paying a huge price in terms of manpower, military equipment, and loss of friendly partners in Europe. Similarly, whenever China is assertive, it pushed its East Asian neighbors into the US arms. A fear of Maoist China drove many Asian states into anti-communist alliances in the Cold War. When China's rise was seen as benign under Deng Xiaoping, there was little imperative to counter Beijing. But as an assertive era under Xi begins, we've seen China's neighbors run to the United States for protection. Regional institutions have often helped the larger powers to avoid this problem. After the Second World War, Germany and Japan subordinated their sovereignty to larger institutions. The European Union in the case of Germany, and the bilateral alliance with the US in the case of Japan. In Southeast Asia, the largest country, Indonesia, chose to adopt a low profile to make the ASEAN work. Russia's efforts to build a Eurasian economic union with the former republics of Soviet Union has not worked. Variations in history and politics in different regions produce varied outcomes in the efforts to create regional institutions that can mitigate, dampen tensions between neighbors. In South Asia, for a variety of reasons, the SARC has not taken off. Pakistan's reluctance to facilitate regional economic integration until its bilateral issues with India are sorted out is one of those. We know from the last SARC summit in Kathmandu that the problem, I'm not criticizing Pakistan, because Pakistan has a sovereign right to do what it wants. If it doesn't want to cooperate with India, that's fine. But that's a choice it's making. But if that means the rest of us will have to make our own choices as well. So that's what the attempt then so if SARC is not working, what does India do? I think it's important for India to reassure its neighbors who would welcome any regional format to engage with India, and not just bilaterally. So Delhi must, I think, focus on developing other regional institutions that can help create more confidence and reassurance among its smaller neighbors. So the Trans-Regional BIMSTEC Forum, in which both Nepal and India are members, is one. The sub-regional BBIN is another. While the former BIMSTEC has some distance to go, the latter seems to have some promise. But in the end, India will have to find bilateral and unilateral means to reassure its neighbors. One important measure in reassurance would be to end the intervention in the internal affairs of neighbors. One reason the British Raj succeeded in South Asia was a clear bargain with smaller neighbors, a policy of non-intervention in return for collaboration on external security. The two sides to it, non-intervention in internal affairs, but partnership in external security. But I think that structure has eroded for various reasons over the last 75 years. And I think today the conditions are very different, but the cost-benefit calculus of intervention suggests avoiding them is a better course for India. An Indian policy of non-intervention is not a favor to its neighbors, but to itself. because by meddling in the internal affairs, Delhi becomes a party to the local disputes and also becomes vulnerable to manipulation by different forces for their own individual benefits. Experience with India's interventions in the neighborhood are making Delhi aware today of the limitations of external actors in shaping the complex internal politics of other societies. It's not easy how powerful you are to shape another society, whatever grand design that you might have. It took the Americans $5 trillion and thousands dead to bring the Taliban back. This notion that you can transform Taliban by external intervention, it didn't work. Look at Haiti in the Caribbean, next door to the United States. It's been a democracy, was a democracy as long as US was. But yet, after all these 2 centuries, the American efforts to transform Haiti internally have not worked. Therefore, I think realists will recognize the limits purely from a first principles of realism rather than is it good or bad or for any sentimental reasons. I believe it's in the interest of Kathmandu to widen the, now I'm saying, while India should stop interference, I'm saying, in quotes at least, Nepal should do more intervention in India. Why do I say that? I believe it's in the interest of Kathmandu to widen the interface of engagement with the Indian society. It's one thing to keep saying, look, India must do this, India must do this. But you got to reach out, because it's a large, complex society, you got to reach out to different elements, formations, sections of India's own society that can give you a wider opportunity to produce results that you would like. Over the last few decades, I believe, the interface has narrowed down to few government officials in the embassy, MEA, and the PMO. Nepal must begin to focus on a broader engagement with the Indian society, including its armed forces, business community, political parties, state governments, media, and the civil society groups. But it's not some abstract notion I'm trying to tell you, but this is exactly how India altered the dynamic of US engagement with India. That is, it's only by reaching out to the Congress, it's only by reaching out to the US business, the diaspora, a whole range of groups, that you produce an outcome in the larger society that is favorable to you. Therefore, it's very, very important to take the initiative to use your agency to shape the outcomes rather than merely being a demander. A more intensive and wider outreach from Nepal would be beneficial for India by acting as a potential balancer against impulsive activity by a small set of decision makers in Delhi. Let me conclude by turning to the question of ideology and interests. I would emphasize the importance of discarding ideology in favor of a pragmatic pursuit of national interests by Nepal and India. Ideologies have often done much damage to the ability of Delhi to judge the external world, especially the great power relations and their consequences for India. There's a big debate now, if you read Mr. Jaishankar's new book, that he's arguing that, look, Nehru fundamentally misread the global, forget the political part of it, but Nehru fundamentally misread the nature of PRC, the nature of the dynamic that was unfolding, and the ideology of building Asian solidarity created conditions under which where India had to suffer. So if you say that there is a contestation in the elections today, but the fact is that abandoning pragmatism or letting ideology overtake your policies has had disastrous results. Commitment to a specific type of developmental ideology, actually, it's not, most Indians won't tell you this, that India's relative economic decline between 1950 to 1990, India went from one of the top economies of the world. India was number 7 or 8 in 1950 in the global hierarchy. It went down way below 10 because the socialism, state socialism of India, that policies actually reduced India's economic weight, on India's weight in the global trade. So what was a period of economic decline purely because we refused to change. Deng Xiaoping changed Maoist ideology, but it took until 1990 when we went bankrupt and went broke for India to change the course. But those 40 years took enormous toll on India's economy, and I think we're still struggling to overcome all the consequences of that. So independent India's expansive idealism and internationalist ideology led to profound miscalculations in Delhi's international relations in the second half of the 20th century. Some of them have persisted into the 21st century Indian foreign policy. Consider the heavy weather the UPA government made of the historic civil nuclear initiative. For anyone practical, it was an open and shut case that India would put some reactors under safeguards in return for lifting the embargo against international cooperation with India. But the UPA government turned it into a nightmare. Poor Manmohan Singh had to go to parliament, seek a vote of confidence. What was a simple exercise, because of the anti-Americanism, because of the ideology of posturing to your domestic audiences, that what was a straightforward, simple mission became a massive political crisis and exercise. In Nepal too, if I might be permitted to say, internationalist ideology has often come in the way of the pragmatic pursuit of external relations, especially economic. Recall the political turbulence in Kathmandu in approving the US Millennium Challenge grant a few years ago. Both Delhi and Kathmandu have much to learn from Beijing, whose record since the creation of People's Republic has shown overall tilt towards pragmatism that put pragmatism above communist ideology. I'll just give you one example. In the Korean War, 1950 to 53, thousands of Chinese soldiers died, including Mao Zedong's own son, who was in the Air Force. But barely 18 years later, Mao Zedong was cutting a deal with the Americans. That is, if he saw a problem from Russia, Mao Zedong was willing to move closer to the Russians, closer to the United States. So I think Chinese have moved from one side to the other. What the Chinese say, what is the word? Leaning on one side. First to the Russian side, then to the American side, now they're back with the Russians. So this notion that there is only a permanent orientation, I think is a fundamental mistake. I think all of us in India and Nepal, especially on the left and the center, we kind of trapped by our own ideological preconceptions, while Chinese experience tells us there's enormous room for pragmatism. Beijing has shifted effortlessly from one close alignment to another, with Russia in the 1950s and 2000s, and the US in the 1970s and 80s. Even as it challenges US primacy in Asia today, Beijing continues to engage the US and Europe to Western capital and technology for its growth. Beijing had no problem welcoming investment from Japan, its former colonizer, in transforming Chinese infrastructure some decades ago. Today, Nepal and India are facing a perilous moment in global affairs and are in the danger of being sucked into great power rivalry. I believe it's also a moment of opportunity. It promises greater political agency for smaller countries and rising powers, with the will and the capability to take advantage of the international situation through careful diagnosis and pragmatic engagement. Marxists often call us to dispassionately assess the concrete conditions of the external world. It's a valuable instruction that could facilitate better appreciation. What is the word? I mean, I was also a Marxist in JNU, so I'm telling from my own experience. What did we say? The correlation of forces. Must a correct reading of the correlation of forces. That's how you begin. Therefore, that must be one not tempered by ideology, but from the first principles of material capabilities and orientations. So therefore, I believe that today, as it takes look at the world today, India bets that it can build a productive relationship with Nepal, not on the basis of sentiment, religious or otherwise, or a nostalgia for the Raj legacy in the subcontinent. It has every incentive today to modernize the bilateral relationship with Nepal on the basis of pragmatism. That is, there is a new realism, I mean, we can argue about it, in Delhi. An interest-based approach in Kathmandu could cut through a lot of accumulated clutter on its relations with Delhi. It is possible to imagine that a Nepal-first strategy in Kathmandu and a neighborhood-first policy in Delhi can be brought in greater harmony and produce vast benefits to our people. So whatever might be our current challenges, there's much room for Kathmandu and Delhi to travel together and hopefully into the future. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Professor C. Raja Mohan, for your lecture. Now we will go for a focused question and answer session. For the sake of time, I'd like to request the interested participants to introduce oneself briefly and put forward the question directly. We'll take 3 questions, 3 to 4 questions in a round.
Not visible.
So let's begin.
Thank you. This is Dwarika Dungel, a student of social science. First of all, I would like to congratulate you, Professor C. Raja Mohan, for providing a wonderful and excellent perspective of the global order, regional order, and the Nepal-India relationship. Now, I want to raise a question. As a keen observer of relationship between our 2 countries, especially on water and border, I have a query to make. In the context of the current Modi government neighborhood first policy, written commitments made in the past, including the points included in the joint statement issued at the end of the visit of PM Modi to Nepal in 2014, and existence of the bilateral mechanism, including that of the Foreign Secretary level committee, why matters related to Pancheshwar multipurpose project DPR preparation, source of the Mahakali River, Kalapani border on at the Susta in the Gandak River area, additional entry point for international airports of Bhairava, and cross-border direct flight between Pokhara, Bhairava, and Lucknow are yet to be realized.
I read your article sometime, I think in 2020, you said that Delhi should maintain a interest-based relation with Nepal, not a special relation that you have mentioned. If I recall the article, it was appear in the Indian Express sometime in March 2020. So what we see that India should develop this type of relation, interest-based relation with Nepal. As our Secretary Dungel just said, that we have differences in Kalapani, 50s treaty, EPG report is not taken. So there are issues lying, the complex issues are lying. So let this complex issue keep aside and also go the other relation without hampering the bedrock of the India-Nepal relation.
Thank you. My name is Chandradev Bhatta. I'm a student of political science. Professor Raja Mohan, you presented a very excellent lecture. But I have small reservations, or I really don't agree what you have said about realism. You said realism can improve the relations between our 2 countries. I really don't think so, primarily because if you look at into the real world of the politics, India is also far behind. If you look at the top 10 powerful countries in the world, India is nowhere there. If you look at Nepal, is engaging with all those 10 powerful countries in the world. So I don't think that's really going to help us out, because realism somehow does not really match with our realities as well. We're talking about the border issues. Then if India becomes realist, Nepal also becomes realistic approach, if we adopt, I don't think we're not really going to reach anywhere. The best way perhaps would be somewhere between the liberal constructivism theories, I would say, that can resolve some of our outstanding issues. I don't think we can really surrender some of our historical, the historical relations. They are playing quite important role in binding the people together for a long period of time. That's the reality we have to understand.
I said, sir, right in the beginning that I'm not here to negotiate on behalf of the government of India. Look, you can go into any number of details. Look, I love to see neighbors who don't have problems. Even US and Canada, US and Mexico have problems. The best neighbors you can think of. So therefore, look, there are always going to be issues. So what I tried to focus, what are the structural challenges? How do we overcome them so that you create the trust to start taking one issue after another off the table? So there's only one way, which is to keep negotiating and finding solutions. And there, I've argued that pragmatism is the only way to go. So I think any number of issues that exist between us. But I think if you look at the last 20 years, I mean, there's been some progress. on trade and cooperation. There's some improvement in connectivity. But if you say, look, if everything is going to be sorted out, that we'll all be out of business, diplomats, scholars and analysts. But I think, are we on a trajectory of sorting out problems? I think there's been some progress, but there have also been some new problems compared to the old issues that we have. Second, I think on India's strategic autonomy, look, I'm a skeptic of strategic autonomy. You know, look, you let one slogan define your policy. In fact, I would say the strategic autonomy argument was used in India by the left to prevent cooperation with the United States. It never objected to India's relationship with Russia or China, but always opposed. When it comes to the US, oh my God, we got to be strategically autonomous. So I think this, again, I think if you cut through it and see it, that argument of sovereignty and strategic autonomy were ideologically used against cooperating with the US, rather than, that was the argument between CPIM and Manmohan Singh in 2005 to 2008. So I think don't take these slogans too seriously. The question is, are we putting our interests at the top? Are we bringing more prosperity to our people? Are we bringing more peace to our neighborhood? Those should be the issues. But the moment you put slogans around them, then actually there's the surest path for failure in terms of what we need. On the question of India-China trade, you mentioned, look, the fact that we have 50,000 troops locked up at 17,000 feet, yet we are trading with China because China is the #2 economy. And because of the last 30 years, the interdependence between Indian and the Chinese economies is huge. So you're trying to manage it. That doesn't mean you don't do anything about it. For example, on 5G and on 6G, India has kept the Chinese out. So I think you have to define your interests first. This is what I want in the next 10 years. How do I get there? Rather than saying, I'm autonomous, I'm sovereign, therefore I'm not going to do a whole lot of things. And I think this approach has been a seriously problem for, I think India would have done much better if you had more pragmatic approach, somewhat like the Chinese Communist Party had a better appreciation of the global affairs and more pragmatism in conducting it, and always invent a slogan to suit the need, not let the slogan decide what you want to do. So I think that is something I think we all can learn from the Chinese. On the question of SARC, look, it's not a question of, it is a choice that Pakistan makes. Look, till you solve Kashmir dispute, I'm not going to trade with you. That issue, I cannot alter that calculation of his. He has to make the decision. Right now, Chinese say, we can't even talk to you. Sorry, Pakistanis say, they put preconditions today, unless you resolve, unless you reverse the 370 decision, we're not going to talk to you. So I think these are choices a country makes. And the question is, does the rest of the region make itself a hostage to one country? Does like if you go to Europe, there's ideas about 2-speed Europe, 3-speed Europe, where you can move, keep moving. You know, it is not, the SARC is not the purpose. SARC is only one objective. I know there's a lot of sentiment and attachment to SARC in Kathmandu. After all, this is the headquarters of SARC. But the fact is, what is the objective? Where do we want to go? We want more regional integration? Then try and get it done, whatever means we can do, rather than getting stuck on one particular mechanism. So look, I think political science, you know, I'm not a fan of constructivism, but you have your ideas. But I think even the strongest ideologies of the last few years, given what's happening in Europe today, given what's happening in Asia, realism is back, I'm afraid, and geography is back. All the things we thought were not relevant today, they come back in such a big way. Therefore, I think thinking geopolitically, thinking geoeconomically, thinking with interests at the top of the agenda, those are already come into the play, and I think we'll all benefit more if we focus on that rather than, political science is a way of explaining the world. It's no diplomat will tell you that they're going to be taken in by that kind of theories because for them, operationally, what you do is far more different than how we, as students of political science or international affairs, explain the issues. So therefore, I would say there are two realisms. Realism with small r, realism with a capital R. But my sense is, when I talk about pragmatism, and realism with small r, that's where we need to.
Thank you for your insightful presentation on changing global order, shift of power in Asia, and Nepal and India relations. I'm Pragya Ghimire. I'm international relations scholar as well as executive board member of Institute of Foreign Affairs. In the past and for many decades, the Indian economy was characterized by the Hindu rate growth, averaging around 4% GDP growth. Now, as per the World Bank, India is likely to achieve at least 6.5 or around 7% growth every fiscal year to become the world's third largest economy by 2027. One of the greatest achievements of India during the last decade in the global leadership role, particularly in economic diplomacy, including India's agenda-shaping role in various global fora, including the United Nations, G20, BIMSTEC, G7, and others. We know that India's rise will have a spillover effect and definitely help Nepal to realize its economic development aspirations. Although we have experienced some challenges in our Indo-Nepal relationship in the past, but we also see bounty of opportunities in the new world order where India is a significant global player. In this context, and based on your experiences, what could Nepal do more to take advantage of India's rise, particularly to effectively pursue economic diplomacy in the areas of trade, finance, investment, and tourism? Thank you, Professor.
One of the biggest issues that we as a small country face today is ensuring strategic autonomy in terms of our decision making. And you just highlighted different changes that are taking place and also highlighted the need of recalibrating our foreign policy. The changes that we have witnessed at the global level, at the regional level, and to be precise, if you look at Nepal, earlier India considered Nepal as its sphere of influence. It didn't want any other major player to be here. And then since 2008, there is China, there is elephant in the room, and China is also wielding its influence in Nepal, and also you can see the growing engagement, the growing presence of US. And forget about European Union, they are also there. But in this context, like we could see, all these countries, all these players, trying to influence our decision-making, capability. And we could see this when it came to our MCC thing and BRI and other things. So in this context, what kind of strategy that Nepal should adopt? What is your suggestion? Okay. Just to make sure that we are able to take independent decision based on our interest. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Raja Mohan. I'm Santosh Sharma. In recent years, India has put forward the idea that it is a civilizational power, with the assumption being that it's not going to be any similar power to other established major powers in the system. As a realist, do you think major powers can be any different in terms of the way they approach or have an outlook of a different international affairs? If so, in what critical ways do you think India will have a different outlook of foreign affairs as it embarks on the way to be a major power by itself? Thank you.
I should say what Nepal should do. I mean, you want to get me into trouble? So look, that's the last thing I'm going to do here. Stand up and tell this large Nepali audience what they should do. No, it's not even if I don't represent the government. Last thing for Indians to do is to tell Nepalese what to do. So it's your sovereign right. I think that's what sovereignty means. Look, you have to make those judgments. This is where the world is, this is what my interests are, how do I get there? So I think this is not, by my telling you or Government of India telling you or anyone telling you, it doesn't make any sense. So I think it's really your internal debate, your choices that you have to make. And that has to come from your political process. Your elite that is sitting here, their internal deliberations, what do we do to advance Nepal's interests, or what are Nepal's interests? How does Nepal become more prosperous? I mean, I wouldn't say Nepal is a small country. I mean, it's 30 million these days is pretty big. you have a massive diaspora, you're growing remittances. So it's not that, as I said, look, Singapore's case. Singapore, less than 5 million people, I mean, has a per capita income today of $90,000 per capita. So it's not the smallness is the issue. The issue is, what is the strategy? How do you work? This is where the world is, this is what my geography says, this is what my advantages, this is what my disadvantages. Within that, how do I progress? I mean, that is the question, and that question, you have to take into advantage, decide what given this is what good old Marxists say, correlation of forces. You start with the global correlation of forces. This is where the regional thing is. This is what my opportunities, these are my comparative advantages. What do I do with it? For example, hydropower, I know it's a big controversial issue. Today, the biggest champions of power sector are not the oil companies, but it is the artificial intelligence companies. Today, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, they're looking at, they want power because these damn data centers, they consume so much. Each time you do a search on Copilot, or if you're using Microsoft Edge, or if you do ChatGPT, it is running through massive data to pull out those 500 words for you, that the electricity consumption of AI infrastructure is so large. Microsoft wants even to go into the nuclear power. So anywhere they can get power. So here is a comparative advantage that you have. You don't have to give it to India. You can call the global companies and say, look, how do we make the best money out of? If people want power, here is potentially surplus power. How do you produce it? So therefore, I think it is building on your comparative advantages that at a time when the structure, that's what I went into so much detail on the global, the structure of the global economy is changing. New technologies are coming into play. The question is, how do you take advantage of it? India is taking advantage in some form by using its talent to deploying its human resources to get some benefits. So each country will have to do its own sense of how do you take advantage of the new dynamic. I think the question of third largest economy, look, I know we will be the third largest in the next 2 years, but we will be a distant third, a very distant third. Nobody's going to dislodge China from number 2. Japanese currency rates have fallen, so therefore Japanese have fallen below Germany last year. Next year they'll fall below India. Because India is growing, Japan is not growing as much. So I think getting to third position does not still solve my per capita GDP problem. Even at today India's per capita is just about less than $3,000. So for me, the challenge is to make India a $5,000 per capita income. How do we get there is the question. Third is you're automatically there because the aggregate size is so large. Getting to be the third largest economy is okay, but it's important achievement. But the real challenge is the internally per capita income is still low. All of South Asia. Bangladesh is around 2,000, slightly more than India, 2,800. And Pakistan. I mean, how many of you notice? I mean, Pakistan has dramatically fallen off the cliff. Today, Pakistan's per capita GDP is half that of Bangladesh. Half that of Bangladesh. Because population is growing, economic growth rate has slowed down. So you have that huge change that is taking place. Bangladesh is the second largest economy, while Pakistan, which had such, at one point, Pakistan was the fastest growing economy in South Asia. It was, South Korea, everybody was envying Pakistan in the 1950s. So you can make mistakes. So the key question is, how do you keep making yourself prosperous? That should be the question. So third is fine. I mean, that's an important landmark. But the real challenge is, how do we increase the India's domestic welfare of its people that requires raising the per capita income to at least 5,000. And the ambition, Mr. Modi's ambition, at least at 2047, at least we should get to 10,000, which is kind of level where you become a developed country. China today is at $12,000 per capita. So the thing is to get to per capita issue, and I think that is the big. On the question of, again, on strategic autonomy. Look, I don't like this word strategic autonomy because I believe it's like saying birds fly, fish swim. Every state, small or big in the international system, tries to maximize its room for maneuver within the constraints that it has, geographic, economic, historical, whatever it is. Every state, whether it's Maldives, Bhutan, Nepal, Singapore, everyone is trying to maximize their autonomy. But nobody has absolute autonomy. Look at America's autonomy. They can't tell Netanyahu what to do. So this notion that using the idea of strategic autonomy means nothing. That's a condition, but that's not the goal. Your goal is not, like every morning you get up and say, am I strategically autonomous today? That's what in India, what the left did in India, what the left and center did. The question is, am I rich? Am I prosperous? Those are the questions to ask, not, is my policy strategically autonomous? Am I sufficiently non-aligned today? Have I got equal distance between America and China? Am I balanced sufficiently between Russia and America? The fact is, if you build yourself up, your options will widen. But if you forego cooperation in the name of ideology, you're never going to grow out of it. So I think we wasted so many decades by elevating non-alignment and strategic autonomy as some kind of a mystical qualities only Indians have, right? What Mr. Muizu of Maldives tells, get lost, what do you do? So this notion, this using strategic autonomy has been a big scam, if you will. I can say that. The question is, are you rich enough? Are you progressing? Are you getting enough benefits to your people? Those are the issues, and I think here the focus should be on that. That's why I said when I say interests above ideology, the question is, how do you generate prosperity? How do you bring more security to your people, rather than saying how much of a strategic autonomy that I have. Strategic autonomy is a condition that every country has. As I said, today, thanks to the great power rivalry, there is actually more agency for every one of us. If India-China are fighting, you have a chance to set your own terms. So even the smallest country, Solomon Islands, is playing the US-China card. So I'm not saying it's a crude thing that you do, but the fact is what your interests are, how do you build on those interests? That is, you can be a state, maximize your interests, maximize your gains from bargaining with the major powers, rather than saying equidistance, non-aligned, neutral, which has been the source of debate, both in Nepal and India, unfortunately, and not the outcome. The outcome must be, people must be more prosperous.
Student of national security, your last or closing word was travel together. I think in asymmetric relationship, it's very, very hard to travel together between rich and poor, big and small, strong and weaker, So that is what is the reality in South Asia today. My question is, none of the outstanding issues between Nepal and India have been resolved under Modi's two consecutive terms. Following Indian media, is it likely to win in ongoing election and become prime minister again? So in your views, how do you visualize Modi 3.0 in terms of his assertiveness in resolving regional issues? For example, reviving SAARC or BVIN, or reviving or revitalizing other regional institutions, and also solving bilateral outstanding issues with Nepal.
You emphasized on the importance of prudence from the smaller as well as the bigger side. Do you think if there is an optimal balance of prudence which can result in subduation of suspicions from both sides? And if there is such a balance which may happen in the future, which side may shoulder the greater burden, sir? Thank you.
To listen to you, and of course, your presentations are always so brilliant that it triggers your mind in different directions. And so I was grappling with the idea of which of the subjects you've elaborated so well I should focus on. But your mind, your last comment really triggered my mind, and as a result I stood up to ask you this question. One is, students of international relations, we know that when it comes to real national interest, not even your best friends can be your champions. And that's precisely what I think the biggest takeaway for me as far as your lecture this evening is concerned. Now, of course, you talked about a lot about yourself as a realist, and of course, as a very well-known Indian scholar, a real matter of significance for us, in the sense that one of the biggest realities of Nepal is we are between India and China. That's a fact of geography. So in the event of, I'm not saying that this is going to happen soon, but in the event of a real conflict between the US and China, as a well-known scholar, what do you think India's position is going to be in that scenario? India's position is going to be. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Buddhi Narayan Sastra. I'm a border researcher. You mentioned about the open border between Nepal and India. Yes, there is an open border regime between Nepal and India. But open border has been misused by unwanted elements. Criminals commit crime in one country and they infiltrate in other countries easily. My question to you, what is your opinion to regulate the border between Nepal and India? Thank you.
I'll try and be brief. I think we're already crossed the time. Look, earlier there was a question on civilizational states. Look, I think, again, as a realist, my thing is being a civilizational state and a large society does not fundamentally alter the realities of the international system in which you operate. So it gives you some advantages, it also gives you many disadvantages. So I wouldn't make that too much of, of a civilizational stuff. Like Soviet Union said, look, they were an internationalist, communist state spreading global revolution. Today, Putin says we are a civilizational state, we're going to talk about values. But I think in the end, you can be civilizational or a revolutionary state, but if you don't make economic progress, then all this means very, very little. On the question of asymmetry, look, asymmetry is part of life. It's not a unique condition in Nepal. I'm asymmetric. India and China, we saw ourselves as equals till late 80s. Today, Chinese GDP is 5 times larger than India's. Chinese military spending is 4 times larger than India's. So I have to deal with that reality. So merely saying asymmetric, therefore we cannot have good relations. There is no symmetry. Life, as we know in our ordinary life, no two individuals are equal. We don't have the same amount of money, or you might have a better car than I have, or you might have better salary than I get. This notion of equality, everyone is equal, doesn't exist. Even in any normal life. They couldn't even do it in the communist countries. Therefore, asymmetry is part of international life. The question is, how do you manage asymmetry? How do you deal with that reality? How do you build collaboration where you can? And how do you limit the dangers of too much of asymmetry? So if somebody asks me, what does India do? India, to reduce the asymmetry with China on the military side, we are doing more with the Americans, right? We're collaborating with Japan. We're collaborating with the Australians. But you don't want to go to the full extent where you become part of the conflict yourself. So that is a balance you have to constantly maintain, and that's where the question of prudence comes in. That is, we have a problem with China. Does it mean we can wish away China? Americans are far away. The Chinese keep telling you, Uncle Sam is far away. We are next door. So what do the Chinese have a saying, a nice saying, which is a next door neighbor is more important than a distant relative. So there is that problem. So I need to use external power to balance, but at the same time, I'm not going to provoke China into a conflict. And that's why India, see, for Australia, for Japan, they're part of an alliance system. India is not part of an alliance system. So it will continue to negotiate, find ways to resolve the issues with China, while at the same time building ourselves stronger in collaboration with the United States. That's exactly what Mao and Deng did. Mao Zedong wouldn't leave Moscow until he signed a treaty with Stalin. Then 20 years later, he was receiving Nixon, because the Soviet Union was a problem. Therefore, they used America to build themselves up and push the Russians out. Today, they're again in alliance with Russia to defeat the Americans. So I think the question then is, how do you build your strengths? How do you build your national power, national capabilities? And I think that is the real issue, and asymmetry alone on its own is not a problem. That's a real condition into which we do. Modi 3.0, I don't know how exactly it will play out, but the fact is, if you see last 10 years, if you see India's relationship, some relationships have improved with Bangladesh. The amount of trade with Bangladesh today, road networks have opened up, river waters, trade has opened up. So I think some good things have happened, but with Pakistan, we have a problem. But with Nepal, Sri Lanka, I would say, the relationship, there have been some progress in the last 10 years. We can dispute about, was it good enough or not good enough? But the fact is that there is growth and progress in many bilateral relationships. And as India becomes a bigger economy, its ability to give $4 billion to Sri Lanka in the time of crisis was one part. So as the capabilities grow, material capabilities grow, what India can do in the region would also grow. On the question of prudence, big and small, is again, see, look, it's not how small you are, it's your location matters. For example, I was saying, if you are a small country in Africa with lithium and cobalt, the whole world is begging you, get me rare earths, because everything in your mobile, your digital, your AI, everything depends on rare earths. So, but is there a state capable of using that advantage smartly? In Congo, they're not able to, because the country is fragmented. But a Singapore uses its location to its benefit. So the question is, whatever resources that you have, whatever God has given you, do you have the capacity to leverage that, to ensure your progress? That is the issue, because merely saying big and small tells us nothing, because there's always somebody bigger and somebody always smaller. But I think the real story is, how do we manage the basic conditions that we have? On the question of sentiment in terms of how we progress, I mean, what you asked, I think the key is, again, I think the strategy, at least in Delhi, as far as I can see, is to build up your national capabilities. See, there's a sense that we were not doing manufacturing enough. So now you have the PLI, production-linked incentive scheme. So Apple phones are finally being produced in India. 10 years ago, there were no Apple iPhones being produced in India. So I think where you can create incentives to build yourself up, and as you said, it's not on the basis of sentiment. We can only progress on the basis of interest, where both sides can benefit, rather than merely saying, look, we are brothers, we are Asians, we are solidarity. We kept saying that with China. I mean, nothing has happened. So I think sentiment is not going to take us anywhere. Sentiment is good for giving speeches by foreign offices, but that's not how you build relationships. Can only be built on interest. On the open borders, I think you raised a good question. Keeping the border open means nothing, but an open border without extradition, legal management, greater cooperation between the law enforcement agencies, between the two sides, that's one huge issue. So that's a precondition. Actually, if we want to maintain a productive open border, you need trade facilitation, you need better infrastructure, you need better cooperation between the policing agencies on both sides, you need the capacity to manage the environmental problems, because those are transborder issues. So the open border it's actually demands a lot of productive activity between the two states. Like if you go to Canada, US, there is American customs agents are sitting in the Nepal on the American side, sorry, on the Canadian side. Canadians are sitting on the American side. Instead of doing 2 customs checkpoints, you have one point where the two sides sit together and do it. Someday, if India and Nepal can say, look, we have a common procedure to manage this, that is the way to go. And I think some parts of Europe are doing it. For example, if you want to go to the US, you go through Abu Dhabi. I'm not plugging for the airlines over there, but you get your visa, your immigration clearance done in Abu Dhabi. So land in wherever landing in the US on a domestic side. So these are not insurmountable obstacles. The question is, that's again, what is intangible is the trust, that way we can do things in which both sides can benefit. That is the key issue, and I think that's what we need to do. And I'll just conclude, by saying that let's not be trapped by ideologies. Let's not be trapped by slogans of how do you, the big ideas in terms of, but the key is, the principal question is, what do we bring to our people by using foreign policy as a way of expanding your national capabilities, bringing more prosperity and greater security? That, I think, is eminently possible for India and Nepal in the coming years, with all the problems that we have, unresolved issues, old and new. But my sense is the logic of geography is still going to be there with us. And my sense is you can dismiss geography as tyranny, try to fight it, or you can treat it as a destiny that make the best of what we have so that our people across the two sides of the border can actually prosper in the days ahead.
May I now request the Honorable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs, Mr. Narayan Kaji Shrestha, for his concluding remarks.
Keynote Speaker, Professor Sri Raja Mohan, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, friends from media, good evening to you all. I am delighted to witness the presence of respectable personalities of various walks of life in this third edition of Professor Yadu Nath Khanal Lecture Series. This is a platform envisioned by the Ministry for constructive and insightful deliberations on foreign policy matters of vital national interest. Your valuable presence added significant value to this event. From what I saw today during the interaction, I am confident that the YNK Lecture Series will contribute remarkably as a platform for generating knowledge and sharing ideas, stimulating thoughts, and expanding the horizon of understanding on the issues of Nepal's foreign policy and diplomacy in the ever-evolving situation and complex dynamics of world affairs. This time, we had the privilege of pursuing through analysis and thought-provoking ideas from Professor Sri Raja Mohan on the theme of Nepal-India relations, prospects, and pathways. As a renowned professor and a proficient foreign policy analyst, Professor Raja Mohan made succinct analysis of the current global and regional issues amidst which we need to chart our course ahead. He also subtly suggested forward-looking strategy and pragmatic ways of strengthening the bilateral relationship between Nepal and India to forge a harmonious, collaborative, and progressive path for shared prosperity. Distinguished participants, as you all know, Nepal is one of the oldest independent states in Asia and was never ever colonized. Our recorded history, even before the reunification of modern Nepal, speaks volumes about the legacy of our foreign policy with neighboring countries. Our foreign policy conduct is based on non-alignment, Panchashil, the principle enshrined in the UN Charter and norms of global peace. Nepal's foreign policy is directed towards maintaining international relations based on sovereign equality, protecting sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity, and national interest of the country, and promoting national prestige in the national community. We aim to establish Nepal's credentials as a peaceful, inclusive, and democratic country while striving for sustainable economic growth and development through mutually beneficial partnerships. Apart from expanding and consolidating bilateral relations with all friendly countries, we also give importance to regional cooperation and multilateral affairs. We believe that today's global problems call for the global solutions and that the UN is the best place to play its role. Our relations with all countries are guided by the theme of friendship, mutual respect, and cooperation. Nepal has always maintained friendly and cooperative relations with our neighbors, maintaining close and cordial relationship with immediate neighbors is our top priority while placing the national interest at the core. These relations have expanded manifold in the sphere of political, economic, cultural, and people-to-people relations, among others. The time-tested wisdom, vision, and pragmatism of our predecessors and the magnitude of insights of the persons like the late Professor Yadu Nath Khanal are guidelines of the conduct of Nepal's foreign policy towards these objectives. Dear friends, the last 2 decades have witnessed momentous transformation in Nepal's political system. The promulgation of the Constitution in 2015 was a culmination of our sustained struggle for democracy and people's rights. We are now a federal democratic republic, essentially with socialism-oriented inclusive democracy. This has finally settled the political course for which we fought for long. Democracy and democratic institutions are being strengthened, and we remain fully committed to realize the objectives set by the Constitution. People of Nepal deserve the fruits of peace and democracy. We have to deliver this. After democratic political change, Nepal's main historical task at this juncture is socio-economic transformation to fulfill the long-held aspirations of Nepali people for tranquility, progress, and prosperity. People of Nepal deserve a better living standard and a dignified life free from poverty, hunger, and backwardness. We are convinced that the political gains cannot sustain without a strong base of economic development. Our Constitution incorporates economic well-being and prosperity of Nepali people as a major component of our national interest. The government has been pursuing economic and development policies to realize this objective. We aim to graduating from LDC from status by 2026 and become a middle-income country by 2030. We also need to meet internationally committed development agendas, including SDGs and the Paris Agreement. These all require rapid economic growth in the country. Resources at our disposal will not be sufficient to materialize these goals and targets. This naturally calls for our deeper engagement with our neighbors and other development partners. We are fortunate that both of our neighbors are among the world's economic powerhouses. Nepal stands to get benefit from their phenomenal growth and prosperity through beneficial collaboration in the high potential areas of trade, investment, tourism, and productive value chains. Distinguished participants, as we have focused on the bilateral relations of Nepal with India in this episode of lecture series, I want to recall the major areas of relations between our two countries. Nepal and India are close neighbors, enjoying a long history of friendship and cooperation. Geographical proximity, religious, cultural, and linguistic affinity, economic engagements, and closely knit people-to-people connections are the hallmarks of Nepal-India relations. These relations are nurtured by nature and tied by cultural affinities and are thus comprehensive, multidimensional, and hardly comparable to any others. But there are some issues between our two countries left over by history that need to be resolved through dialogue and diplomacy on the basis of historical facts and in the spirit of good neighborliness. Our closer bonds are reinforced by the 2 centuries firm commitment to the time-tested principle of sovereign equality, peaceful coexistence, goodwill, mutual trust, understanding, and cooperation in a wider range of areas. Exchange of high-level visits has contributed a lot in cementing ties and promoting and deepening partnership in a number of areas. Our two countries have set up different bilateral consultation arrangements to promote various aspects of bilateral relations. These arrangements serve as the facilitating instruments of our ever-evolving and progressing collaboration and partnership. There exist huge potentials for mutually beneficial cooperation in different sectors. Common efforts to realize these potentials would benefit our two countries and peoples. Cooperation in the field of energy is highly important. Proper utilization of Nepal's huge hydropower potential can change the development landscape of our region with clean energy. Connectivity network is being expanded across the border to facilitate trade and transit. We need to further expand and improve connectivity network. Both countries will have to find ways to make trade beneficial to both countries. Nepal's export base is very limited. Nepal's trade deficit continues to rise. We need more investment in productive sectors to expand our trade with India and other countries. Investment in Nepal is secure and profitable. Multinational companies operating in Nepal have been able to repatriate handsome amount from their investment. Cross-border digital connectivity and payment system will facilitate greater flow of interest from India to Nepal. Rich sociocultural assets and nature's unmatched treasures make Nepal a round-the-air destination for all and more so for our Indian friends. Both countries can cooperate to further develop this sector. IT is a promising sector for partnership between our two countries. Collaboration in education, science and technology will also be required to tap the talents of dynamic and burgeoning young population. Nepal's development and economic prosperity will also be in the interest of our neighbors. We need to visualize a big picture to accommodate legitimate interest of all countries irrespective of the size of their size and strength. After all, we need a peaceful and stable neighborhood. Without economic development and prosperity, this cannot be achieved. Partnership flourishes when benefits are judiciously shared. Given its level of development, Nepal needs focused support and cooperation from our neighbors and the international community. In these lines, Professor Mohan's advice on pragmatism and interest-based approach could be the propellants towards more harmonious and productive relations for our countries and peoples. Distinguished guests, before closing, I would like to extend special thanks to Professor Sri Raja Mohan for his highly engaging and forward-looking presentation. I would also like to thank the participants for their active participation through their constructive comments and creative queries during the Q&A session. Let me also extend sincere thanks to Professor Jairaj Acharya for his contribution as an expert member in the steering committee, which is mandated to guide the process of this lecture series. Foreign Secretary and other colleagues in the ministry who have worked hard to bring this lecture to you also deserve my compliments. Special thanks go to the media for their coverage of this program. Through their coverage, they have helped disseminate the message of this lecture to wider audience. I want to conclude this episode with the assurance that the ministry will continue this platform both as tribute to Professor Yadu Nath Khanal and a platform to facilitate deliberations on Nepal's foreign policy and international relations. I thank you all once again.
I humbly express a deep gratitude to Honorable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs. It's my honor now to invite today's keynote speaker, Professor C. Raja Mohan, to receive a token of appreciation. May I also request Honorable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs to hand over the YNK Memorial Plaque to Professor Mohan. I would also like to request Madam Foreign Secretary to join the handover. Now, we will proceed for a few group photographs. First of all, I'd like to request Honorable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs, Madam Foreign Secretary, and former foreign ministers, along with our keynote speaker, for a photograph. With this, we come to the conclusion of the third edition of YNK lecture series. The hard copy of the lecture is available and can be picked up from the registration desk outside the hall when we exit. The lecture will also be uploaded in the ministry's website and YouTube. May I now request distinguished guests and participants to proceed to the Manjari Garden on my left for the dinner. Thank you all and have a great evening.